Thank you, Stephen. A number of guests duly introduced by fellows beg leave to attend your meeting. Is it your pleasure that I welcome them in your name? Thank you. Minutes.
Ordinary meeting, Thursday, the 28th of November, 2024, Burlington House and online. Professor Martin Millett, President in the chair. The minutes of the ordinary meeting of Thursday, the 21st of November, 2024, were read and signed. The following, being in attendance and having signed the obligation required by the statutes, were duly admitted fellows. Tim Bridges, C.J. Faraday, Mark Webb. The following communication was then laid before the Society, Investigating Historic Building Myths by Dr. James Wright, FSA. Thanks to return for this communication. The President announced that the next meeting would be on Thursday, the 5th of December, 2024, and then adjourn the meeting. A reception followed.
Is it your pleasure that I sign these minutes as a true and complete record? Thank you. Ballots.
The following candidates for election we put to a ballot, which closes on the 30th of January, 2025. I'm reading the short version of the blue paper. The full version is available now for inspection on the Fellows platform. Ellen Adams, BA, MPhil, PhD, reader in Classical Archaeology and Liberal Arts, KCL, and a specialist in Minoan Crete. Sophia Adams, BA, MA, PhD, curator First Millennium European and Roman Conquest period, Collections, the British Museum. Luke Amkreutz, PhD, curator in prehistory, National Museum of Antiquities, Leiden. Professor by special appointment in public archaeology. Alexandra Alt, BA, MA, PhD, lead curator, Western Manuscripts, 1601 to 1850, British Library. Rosalind Bonte, BA, PhD, head of archaeological publishing, Brett Paul's Publishers. John David Sebastian Booth, CVO DL MA Oxon, chairman of the National Gallery. Toby Burrows, BA, MA, PhD, librarian, historian, and digital humanities researcher. Noé Conhego Delgado, PhD, lecturer, University of Carlos III of Madrid, and a specialist in the study of coins found in archaeological contexts. Richard Cooper, MA, DPhil, D.Lit, fellow of Brasenose College, and an authority on French Renaissance literature. Jose Antonio Gonzalez Zarandona, PhD, academic reader in heritage studies at the University of Newcastle. Carl Graves, PhD, director, Egypt Exploration Society. Sue Hazer, BA, author, jewellery maker and researcher. Tracy Hill, BA, MA, PhD, Emerita Professor, Early Modern Literature and Culture at the University of Bath Spa. Oliver Jessup, BA, MA, Director, TJC Heritage Limited, the Jessup Consultancy. David Knight, B Muse, M Muse, PhD, Head of Church Buildings for the Church of England. And finally, Han Lee, BA, LLB, Senior Building Materials Specialist at Mola.
Thank you. Admissions.
The following being in attendance and having signed the obligation required by the statutes, desires to be admitted as a fellow. Thomas Henage, Donald Easton, Hannah Morell. Thomas Henage.
Thomas, by the authority and in the name of the Society of Antiquaries of London, I admit you a fellow thereof. Welcome. Congratulations.
Donald Easton.
Donald, by the authority and in the name of the Society of Antiquaries of London, I admit you a fellow thereof. Welcome. Congratulations.
Hannah Morell.
Hannah, by the authority and in the name of the Society of Antiquaries of London, I admit you a fellow thereof. Welcome. Congratulations. We now come to the main business of this evening's meeting, which is to hear a paper from our fellow Professor Oliver Creighton. Oliver is Professor of Archaeology and Director of Research in the Department of Archaeology and History, University of Exeter. His research, which will be well known to many of you in the room, publications, strong interdisciplinary flavour at the interface between archaeology and history. His particular interest in medieval elite culture, buildings and landscapes, and has written widely on castles and their social and landscape context. He's also interested in the archaeology and history of designed landscapes, towns and townscapes, and in conflict archaeology and medieval warfare, which brings him to the topic of this evening's meeting, which is to speak on the Warhorse, the archaeology of medieval revolution, ? Oliver.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, thanks everybody for attending. Thank you for the invitation to speak. It's wonderful to be here, and welcome everybody online as well. Well, my aim today is to present an overview of a research project. It's a research project on medieval war horses, and it's a project that's multifaceted in scope. It's a project, as we'll see, that's interrogated evidence of a variety of different types and at a variety of different scales. The overarching aim of the project is to provide a first ever integrated, a systematic and an archaeologically led study of war horses and horses more generally in medieval England. I should also say that although, as you can see from my slide there, the word war is in bracket. Warhorse, medieval warhorse is the title of the presentation. It's the strapline of the project that I'm going to introduce. But I do want to stress that the evidence I'm going to present today doesn't relate entirely to warhorse. We've had to cast our net a little bit wider to consider many other different types of horses in medieval England. The first point I'd like to make is that horses were everywhere in the medieval world, and they're everywhere in representations, imaginings and reimaginings of the medieval world. Horses were present at and horses were players in some of the key turning points in English history. They bookend our period, the medieval period. To start off, at the time of the coming of the Saxons in the 5th century, leading the charge, as it were two Germanic warrior leaders with horse-related names. They're, of course, Hengist and Horsa. The two names mean stallion and horse. In this period, the horse features very prominently in ritual, particularly in traditions such as horse burial, extending even to the burial of horse heads. Moving on to 1066. Historians have, of course, debated the extent to which Norman cavalry power enabled victory over the Anglo-Saxons at Hastings in 1066. At the Battle of Hastings, Duke William was reputed to have 2 or 3 mounts killed under him. In the pre-conquest period, there's been a key area of debate about the point in time at which the horse was actually weaponized. Received wisdom is that Anglo-Saxon warriors rode to battle, but not into battle. Received wisdom is very much that the introduction of fighting on horseback is an innovation of the Norman conquest in an English context. At the end of our period, Richard III fought on horseback at Bosworth. His supposed words upon being dismounted were immortalised by Shakespeare, of course, and his dead body was unceremoniously slung over a horse to be carried back to Leicester after his defeat. So the project is all about war horses. But in engaging with the subject of war horses, it's important to stress that we have to confront some very deeply ingrained perceptions about knights and their war horses. One of these that will be familiar to many of you is the notion of heavily armoured knights being so heavy that they had to be craned onto their war horses. I want to underline this is absolutely nothing but myth. It's been exposed as myth in a recent very important article by Bob Woosnam Savage, formerly of the Royal Armouries. On the left-hand side is a representation of Charlton's Heston as El Cid, the dead Castilian warrior, strapped onto an enormous war horse and frightening away his enemies. In the project that I'm going to introduce today, one of the most common questions from members of the public, one of the most common observations, most common comments is the idea people ask, is it true that the medieval horse is related to the modern Shire horse? This is an enduring myth that I'm going to hopefully expose as the talk continues. One popular study of war horses generally even styled the war horse of the Middle Ages as the medieval mastodon. In dealing with the subject of medieval horses, we're dealing with a species that had a uniquely close relationship with humankind. War horses had uniquely close relationships with their knightly riders. In the medieval world, there's a great deal of anthropomorphic portrayal of horses in literature. In the literary medieval world, horses are often imbued with human characteristics. Horses were thought to cry, especially upon the death of their riders and owners. Elite horses, really unusual as a species in being named like humans. The first name is very often a coat colour. The second element, like human names, is very often a toponym relating to the stud that they were born at and trained in, or perhaps sometimes the second element relates to the person that gifted that horse. Horses are also the only species, certainly in Western Europe, to be armoured. They have very special status. It's also the case that by the 13th century, it's very clear in documentary sources that there's clear hierarchy of horse types that mirrors the hierarchy of the human world. At the bottom end of the horsey hierarchy, we have pack horses. Then we have rounceys, or ordinary riding horses. These are differentiated from horses called palfreys, which are usually styled as pretty riding horses, which are well known for their smoother gait, useful for traveling over long distances. Then we had horses. The courser is a type of horse associated with hunting. And at the top of the horsey hierarchy, we have the destrier, the classic warhorse. We also, from the later Middle Ages, we have sophisticated texts on veterinary care, which provide detailed advice to owners on veterinary aspects of horse care. We also have texts on breeding and training. The most important of these is a text by the Calabrian knight Jordanus Rufus, which dates to 1250, which provides a method on horse breeding and training that's translated into a variety of different vernacular languages. This slide summarizes some key aspects of the conformation, the appearance, and also some reflections on the value of war horses by the 13th and the 14th century. And the slide you see there is based on advice that is given by Jordanus Rufus in his treatise on advising owners and breeders on the qualities of a prime warhorse. So first and foremost, a warhorse must be a stallion, it must be male. Jordanus Rufus puts a lot of emphasis on the qualities that somebody would observe in the face and the head of a horse. A warhorse's head should be delicate, should be held high. The eyes should be big, bright, and alert. The ears should be pricked up and attentive. The nostrils should be large and flared, which would be an indication of a very healthy respiratory system. We're told that there should be no feathering around the hooves. This is a characteristic of an agricultural beast. The mane should be fine, not shaggy. The neck should be strong. And very intriguingly and very, very importantly, as we'll see when we come on to the archaeological evidence, Jordanus Rufus tells us a couple of very important things about the conformation of the horse's back and rear quarters. We're told that a warhorse should have a back that's narrow and that its power comes from powerful hindquarters. But what's striking is the sheer lack of information in Jordanus Rufus and really every medieval text on horse size. In the great deal of documentary research that's gone into the project, we found only a single reference in the 14th century to a measurement of a horse, a physical measurement of a horse. So reflections on size, really absent in documents. In terms of the cost of a warhorse, by the 14th century, a destrier, a powerful warhorse, would be worth something in the region of 30 to 80 pounds. The most expensive horse that we found a reference to is a 200-pound warhorse at the coronation of Richard II. To put that in perspective, a destrier is worth 200 to 300 times more than a pack horse. A pack horse would typically cost between 5 and 10 shillings. So that's a little bit of historical background. The warhorse is absolutely central to the image of the warrior aristocrat in the Middle Ages. It's intricately bound up with notions of knighthood and the concept of chivalry. The very word chivalry derives from the French word chevalier, horseman. However, I would stress that established understandings of medieval warhorses long hinged on historical scholarship. There are some excellent books written by some of the great and good of medieval history on horses and warhorses. Archaeological approaches, however, been fragmented and to a large extent neglected. However, I must pay tribute to the incredible work of John Clark, his Medieval Horse and Its Equipment, published in 1995. It's a superb study which really set the agenda for the archaeological study of horses. But the evidence that that book drew on was based entirely on London. The starting point of our project, which I'm going to introduce in a moment, is that integrated archaeological study, the different types of archaeological evidence for warhorses, holds huge potential to transform knowledge not only about horses, but about the relationship between horses and society. It can link to debates about the rise of the aristocracy, the impact of the Norman conquest, the changing nature of warfare. So we set up a project, the Warhorse Project, which we were grateful to receive AHRC funding for. It ran 4 years between 2019 and 2023. And it was envisioned very much as a collaborative project that worked between academic institutions and worked with partner organizations. So good archaeology is a team sport, and this project is no exception. That is the research team. I won't name everybody individually, but to stress the individuals there represent a multiplicity of different archaeological specialisms. In essence, I'm a specialist on landscapes and a specialist on buildings. Team members also specialized in zooarchaeology, in material culture, in archaeological science. We collaborated with 2 historians at the University of East Anglia who carried out original primary documentary research, which I'll summarize a little bit later on. We collaborated with the University of Toulouse. That image there is of Ludovic Orlando, one of the world's foremost horse geneticists, who's been able to genetically sample horse remains from medieval England and work with us. We've also worked closely with 2 partner organizations, the Royal Armouries, based up in Leeds. We've had access to their unparalleled collections of arms and armour, and the portable antiquities based in the British Museum. I'm also very proud of the fact that, as well as working with those organisations, those institutions, we've been able to offer something back. With the Royal Armouries, as we'll see, our work on horse armour enriched the Royal Armouries' records on those pieces. With the Portable Antiquities scheme, we've helped produce and update a series of finds guides to help metal detectorists identify equestrian artefacts. So, for the main part of the lecture today, I would like to introduce the 5 key lines of evidence that we've interrogated, we've collated, we've analysed. And this is evidence that ranges from archaeological science through to documentary analysis. So I'll take you through the zooarchaeology, the archaeology of horse bones, material culture, portable objects related to horses and horse armour, visual culture, particularly sculpture and wall paintings, the documentary contribution, and finally, the landscape archaeology, warhorses. The project was funded by the AHRC, who rightly put a great premium on the impact of research, making sure that academic findings get out there to the general public. It's not something I'm going to concentrate on here, but this slide summarises the key aspects of our impactful and outreach activity. We, of course, had a Twitter feed and a social media presence. Press releases generated headlines which went around the world. At the time, I confess, I was slightly horrified with this headline here. This is a piece of a paper that we published on horse size through the Middle Ages. When I saw it, I couldn't quite believe it, but actually, as you'll see, I feature it in all my lectures today. Medieval battles, more a case of My Little Pony than Warhorse. This is an indication of one of the finds guides that we upgraded and updated with the Portable Antiquities scheme. We also ran a Warhorse roadshow, taking displays of equestrian artefacts and bones to displays and reenactments. So moving on, the first work package, as we style it, deals with zooarchaeology, the remains of horse bones and teeth. So our zooarchaeological work package had 3 dimensions. The first of these was building a huge database of metrics from horse bones. These are horse bones from over 170 archaeological sites, totaling well over 8,500 bones from already published sites or sites that are in the realm of grey literature. So that was the first element, a database of horse metrics from bones. The second element was fresh primary analysis of around 20 sites. We selected 20 or so sites. The majority of them were castles and high status sites where we thought we were more likely to get to grips with the physical remains of war horses. So we carried out fresh analysis of those, and I'll present some highlights in a moment. The third element was cutting-edge archaeological science. Alongside the genetic work, which I've already alluded to, we carried out GMM work. Geometric morphometrics is the tongue twister. It's an advanced technique of scanning bones and through advanced digital techniques, working out subtle differences, grouping those bones. It's a type of analysis that is really quite sophisticated. I'm not going to go into huge detail at the moment. The third element was isotopic sampling. More of that in a moment. And if you're wondering what the image is at the bottom here, that is evidence of a warhorse with trauma. That is, you're looking at the underside of a skull from Barnard Castle. And the damage that you can see on the palate there, and damage to the teeth, is caused by a curb bit. With the 20 or so case study sites, we looked for evidence of trauma and pathologies that could be related to the specifically military uses of horses. So the first research highlight from the zooarchaeology work package is the work that we did on horse stature through time. As I say, medieval documents are essentially silent. Not essentially silent, they are silent on horse stature. Our database 171 sites, over 8,000 bones. We were able to map changing horse stature through the medieval centuries using the largest database of horse bones yet assembled for England. For those of you that might be unfamiliar with how we measure horse stature, the important thing is that horse height is measured not to the top of the head, because heads, of course, go up and down. It's measured to the shoulder of the horse, to the withers. And it's measured in hands high. HH is hands high. One hand is 4 inches, 10.16 centimeters. Our graph here shows so that the vertical axis is hands high, and the horizontal axis is the various periods, from late Roman, early Saxon, through to post-medieval. The line in the middle is the median stature for each of those periods. The key point is that there's relatively little variation in the medieval period. The great jump in horse stature occurs in the post-medieval period with the agricultural revolution. There's perhaps puzzlingly a dip in stature in the Norman period that is very, very clear. But the overwhelming finding is quite how small medieval horses are compared to their modern equivalents. In the modern world, the definition of a pony, the threshold for a pony is an animal with a withers height of 1.47 meters, 14.2 hands high. You can see the vast majority of medieval horses are below that threshold. The other piece of evidence, if you plot the height, the withers height of a modern police horse, not a single sample from those 8,000 or so bones would have met the criteria for a modern police horse, 1.68 or 16.2 hands high. That is the most underwhelming slide that I will show you. It's a case study of a site that we reanalyzed in detail. This is a site of Elverton Street in Westminster, London, which was expertly excavated by Mola in the mid-1990s. We were fortunate enough, through a collaboration with Mola, to have full access to that collection. That's the location down here. Elverton Street is down here, Westminster. We are fortunate enough to have access to the Elverton Street assemblage, and were able to transport a great chunk of it back to Exeter. There you see it boxed in front of one of our laboratories. And among the various types of analysis that we carried out on Elverton Street, we carried out some cutting-edge isotopic work, sampling horse teeth to map and plot ratios of strontium and oxygen isotopes. Now, the key thing about the method that we use, and here I must pay tribute to my colleague Alex Pryor, is that the technique which we used in the project involves taking a strip of enamel from the horse tooth, meaning that it is possible to map and chart changing isotopes along the course of the tooth. When several teeth are put together with good conditions of preservation, it's possible to map the isotopic biographies of individual horses as they move around the landscape over the first 3 years of life. And the results were really quite striking. We sampled 15 horses from Elverton Street. They were a mixture of origins. A number of them had domestic origins, particularly in the chalklands of southern and southeast England. But a number of them, between 5 and 7, were internationally sourced, including individuals that came from the Alps, clearly imported at great cost. Another very striking thing that the isotopic analysis told us is, in terms of the individual biographies of these horses, is that many of them had in common that they were sedentary for the early period of life, often between 1.5 years and 2 years, after which they went into service. And you can see quite you can see how they moved around the landscape, often in cyclical ways, moving from one point to another. So that was a first in terms of horse archaeology. Moving on, the second work package involves analysis of material culture, particularly portable objects, and I'll mention armour in a moment. Here I must pay tribute to my colleague Rob Webley, who you see there XRFing some medieval horse harness pendants. And with this work package, we worked very closely with the Portable Antiquities, access to their magnificent database of millions of portable objects, particularly focusing on the equestrian items. In terms of the information that the Portable Antiquities Scheme database holds, I mean, what is very, very striking, if I just highlight the first item on that list, at the time of the project, there are only 145 records of horseshoes in the Portable Antiquities Scheme. That number is completely dwarfed by the number of harness pendants, more of those in a second, and items such as harness mounts, harness fittings. I mean, the key reason is that the Portable Antiquities Scheme database is, of course, largely based on metal detected finds, and metal detectorists are not looking for ferrous objects. They're not looking for iron objects. So it's the copper alloy objects that the Portable Antiquities Scheme is exceptionally strong on. To show you a couple of examples, or one particular example of ways that we were able to produce, I think, new knowledge, new understandings from the Portable Antiquities Scheme database, was this work on horse harness pendants. So if people don't know what horse harness pendants are, the earliest examples date to around the middle of the 12th century. The best way I can describe them is decorative dingle-dangles. They hang on the breastband around a horse. They're purely decorative. The more elaborate versions are decorated with coats of arms and heraldic symbols, for example. The map on the left depicts all harness pendants recorded on the Portable Antiquities Scheme, but we're able to drill down into that data set and examine the distribution of particular pendants associated with particular noble families. So on the left, you see a plot of pendants associated with the Ufford family, the Earls of Suffolk. You see there's actually quite a tight link, quite a tight correlation between their key seats in East Anglia and the distribution of pendants. The de Boon family, Earls of Hereford and Essex, their harness pendants, the distribution of them is depicted here. There's not an incredibly close correlation between that pattern and their seats at Trowbridge, Caldercut, Pleshy and Saffron Walden. But I think those plots are producing new information about the footprint, or should I say the hoof print of families, their retainers, household members. Moving on, the second aspect of our material culture program of work focused on armour, on horse armour. Now, we were particularly keen to approach horse armour from an archaeological point of view. Horse armour has been expertly studied since, well, the late 19th century and before, in fact, but primarily from an art historical point of view. I think I can claim that our project has pioneered an archaeological approach to horse armour, with a focus particularly on what horse armour can tell us about the stature of horses. So to explain the key components of horse armour, I'm going to draw upon our friend Copper. So Copper is a Suffolk punch. Copper is a retired destrier of the royal collection. Copper was a jousting horse that was used in jousting reenactments. So it's close to a medieval warhorse as I think you can get in the present day. The key elements of armour are labelled here. The crupper covers the flanks of the horse. The patral covers its chest. The crinnet, the neck, the pole plate, back of the head, and crucially, for what I'm about to explain, the chaffron. The chaffron is the horse's head defence. So we're keen to investigate the potential of horse armour, what it can tell us about stature. And it's essentially chaffrons that we must rely on because they survive in much greater numbers and they're a much better indicator of horse physiology than the other elements, because cruppers, they come in two components, and it's not, the relationship with the hindquarters of the horse isn't particularly clear. Likewise with the patral, the crinnet on the neck, they expand and contract. If you see them in museum collections, there's often an uneasy relationship between the crinnet and the underlying model or wooden horse. Here's some examples of our archaeological recording of horse armour in progress. On the left-hand side there, you see the earliest surviving piece of medieval horse armour in Europe. It's the famous Warwick Chaffron in the collections of the Royal Armouries held at Leeds that we were privileged enough to be able to analyse. It's an early form of Chaffron. If anybody's seen it in the case, it gives the appearance of being an enormous artefact. It looks as if it would fit a hippopotamus rather than a warhorse. It's got these T-strainer type eyes. As you see there, holes for the horse to see through, mirrored with horses over the nasal area. Fascinating thing about the Warwick Chaffron is that close analysis shows real, genuine war damage. There's an impact point from a bodkin type arrowhead up here, an impact from what is almost certainly a sword, and an impact from, we're not entirely sure, is that a mace? But it's a piece of armour that has been used clearly in combat. Our work involved measuring, analysing armour, particularly Chaffrons, in collections in the UK, particularly the Wallace collection, Tower of London, the Royal Armouries, the Royal Collection, and also abroad, the museum in Vienna, the Met in New York, and other collections as well. We developed a new system for recording Chaffrons. An interesting thing is that museum catalogues typically record maximum dimensions for pieces of armour, but they don't have detailed measurements that relate to the specifics of the design. So we developed a methodology that allowed us to relate horse Chaffrons to the size of the underlying horse. So some headline results are presented in this graph. It shows horse Chaffrons as a proxy for horse size. So we took a great number of measurements, over 20 measurements on each Chaffron, over 130 of them around the world. And we found that of those measurements, it was the eye to ear measurement, the center of the eye to the center of the ear, that was the best proxy indicator of horse size. So every single one of those measurements, every single one of those dots is a measurement on a Chaffron. The horizontal axis is taking you through time from 1400 through to the 17th century. So those are the medieval and just the early modern ones. These are measurements that are taken on modern horses of different types. Ponies, warm bloods, draft horses, and this is Copper, the destrier that we met earlier on. A couple of headline results. The Warwick Chaffron. It's not quite as big as it seems. It's really in the middle of the range, like towards the upper end, but not right at the top of the range for medieval horses. The largest Chaffron that we measured was the Chaffron of the young Henry VIII in the Tower of London, the largest anywhere in the world that we've measured, which tells you something. But Copper is larger still. The modern destrier of the Royal Collection is up here, the largest still. The key finding is that if we project the measurements from modern horses onto our medieval horses, I'm going to show you the range for ponies. That's the range for ponies. So these are modern ponies. These are the medieval horses. Between 40 and 70% of those Chaffrons are made for animals that by modern standards are pony-sized. Moving on, the third work package focused on visual culture. Now, pre-Norman conquest, the evidence of sculptural representations of war horses is crucially important. It's a time before, of course, manuscript illustrations of horses survive. So we collated images of Viking age horse art. There's a compilation of the key surviving examples. Most of those are 9th and 10th century, and you find those depictions on Viking age aristocratic monuments. Horses, often with riders, clearly military gear, are on aristocratic monuments. In some cases, this evidence can raise questions about whether representations show warfare, whether they provide a window into methods of fighting on horseback. So this is a fascinating image. It's from a cross shaft in Cheshire, a place called Neston. You see two opposed horsemen who are fighting with lances. And it looks very much like a later medieval joust. But as I claimed earlier, the received wisdom is that fighting on horseback is really a Norman innovation. I mean, is this evidence for genuine fighting on horseback in the Viking Age? Or is it a more stylized representation? Is there any sense, perhaps, look at that representation of two confronted horses. Is it replicating, is it referencing opposed horses on metalwork of the period? Moving on, I suggest that visual sources, particularly sculptural evidence, has great potential to tell us not just about the military uses of horses, but changing horsemanship. The Gosforth cross here represents, you can see a horse that seems to have an ambling gait. It's the gait is depicted in a very, very clear way. And this ties in with what we know from genetic evidence about the ambling gene being something that we see in the Viking period. This is a later representation. This is Pontefract. This is called the Stump Cross in Pontefract. It's not nearly as well preserved. What I'd like to draw attention to here is the position of the horse's head. So this is a very early Norman sculptural representation of a horse. You see the way there's a lot of flexion in the way the horse's head is positioned. It's a lot closer to the chest. And in slightly later examples, we see this head position with a particular type of bit, the curb bit, which is a type of bit that has a lever within it. And I do think this is a representation which tells us about changing horsemanship immediately, well, at the time of and immediately after the Norman conquest. These are some later medieval visual representations of horses, from the sculptural through to everyday, well, not everyday, livery badges, wall paintings of St. George, and my favorite depiction of all down here, this is a graffiti-style representation of what seems to be a knight on horseback from a slate from medieval Dublin. Is that a practice piece by an artist, by an engraver who's practicing creating a representation on a seal, perhaps? Moving on, work package 4 was where the historians come in. We worked very closely with our co-investigator, Rob Lydiard, and his researcher on the project, Gary Baker. They led a great program of work focusing on the collections of royal stud accounts, which are held by the National Archives in Kew. So Rob, Gary, and the team analysed over 800 royal stud accounts and interrogated them for what those documents tell us about the horses themselves, but also about the locations, the environments horses are being bred and trained within. We were really quite struck that prior to this project, we couldn't find a single example of a map of medieval horse studs. Think about how fundamental horses are to medieval warfare. We thought there'd be a publication that would show the locations of horse studs. Simply wasn't the case. So our project has mapped for the first time the rise and then the decline, concentration in the south of England towards the end of the medieval period of the stud network. In terms of their locations, the key finding is that medieval horse studs sit within deer parks. They're peripheral features within deer parks, chiefly on manors that are long-held royal properties. All of those locations have longer histories of horse breeding. There's a great deal of continuity in the landscapes that are used for horse breeding. And a thing most of those sites have in common is that they lie adjacent to tracts of landscape that might be styled as marginal, areas of wetland, upland, forested areas. So they're very often at the junction of different landscape types. The historical work package, historical document work package, has also provided a great deal of new information about the procurement systems that supported studs. The map that you see there shows the resources that are drawn into a royal stud at Eynsham in Oxfordshire between January and April in 1 year, 1344. Shows resources such as oats, beans, peas, straw, and hay. It gives a sense of the scale of the hinterlands around these sites. Now, in giving a presentation about a project that I'm very, very proud of, I'm rightly, I hope, wanting to stress some of our headline findings. I think it's also appropriate to draw attention to areas where the project didn't quite produce the results we thought it would. And this is one case in point. Moving on to the work package 5, which investigated landscapes and infrastructure. When we put the project design together, we envisaged going out into the landscape, carrying out surveys, particularly topographical and geophysical surveys, to try and recover the footprint of infrastructure within horse studs. It was something that proved simply impossible. We were able to pin down the general locations of studs within parks, but we were not able to pin down the footprints of stables, paddocks, enclosures, and infrastructure. The evidence is simply too ephemeral. But a good example of, not a good example, a slightly atypical example of a horse stud is the one that you see here. This is Odiham in Hampshire, which sits next to the famous royal castle. You see a plot of some equestrian artifacts around it there. Now, Odiham, the park at Odiham was characteristic because it was a park intended for colts. It wasn't for breeding and training all sorts of war horses. It's where all the colts in the royal horse pool were sent to at a certain stage in their life. Moving on, medieval stables have been described as something of an archaeological black hole. And after the work of the project, I really couldn't disagree with this. It's incredibly difficult to find intact physical evidence on the ground, the footprints of medieval stables. The type site, one that people visit, is Kenilworth Castle up here. This is the great Tudor period stable at Kenilworth Castle. Medieval equivalents are really quite difficult to find. It's sometimes the case that medieval stables are hiding in plain sight. This is a case study of a case in point. This is Launceston Castle in Cornwall, which in the excavation report, the building that you see there was identified and styled as a second hall. The excavator claimed it was a second hall and an administrative hall. Re-examination of the archive shows it's clearly not the case. It's a long, thin, narrow building, which is characteristic of stables. It had a drain within it, evidence of posts almost certainly for horses, and there's lots of horse gear within it. So sometimes stables are hiding within plain sight. Another feature of the equestrian landscape that we paid a lot of attention to was a tournament or tilting site. You might style this as the ultimate chivalric landscape. It is the case that at many castles, the length and breadth of Britain, attributions of tilt yards at these sites are fantasy. Bodiam Castle is one example. The tilt yard, it's a Victorian attribution. Of all the sites that we examined, the only site I could feel that I could stand in a particular location and be pretty confident that I was standing on the precise location of a tilt yard was Kenilworth Castle here, which is like the stable, a Tudor period development. The image here is showing a different type of representation of a tournament landscape. With a great wealth of portable antiquities scheme data, we wondered whether it would be possible to try and find tournament locations from portable material culture. And we carried out a preliminary mapping exercise to see if there are correlations between documented tournament sites and concentrations of elite equestrian artifacts. In most cases, there is no link, but in one case, there's a spectacular correlation. And I won't name the place. There are sensitivities here, but suffice to say it's in the North Midlands of England. This is, I think you're looking at the footprint, again, the hoof print, if you want to put it that way, of a tournament site. Each one of those dots is an equestrian item. Lots of them are harness pendants. Without naming the site, it's a little bit difficult to describe, but essentially, received wisdom was that the tournament site was a collection of fields down here. There are some very suggestive field names. But I think our work shows that the tournament site and again, the footprint of tournament activity extends over many, many square kilometers. Whether that's actual tournament activity or it's where participants are being billeted, we don't quite know. So that's a summary of our 5 lines of evidence. This slide brings that together just to stress how those various lines of evidence are complementary to one another. The bones that I started off with provide information about a wide variety of horse types. They show us how stature changes over the medieval centuries. Samples from individual horse bones have the potential to reconstruct individual horse biographies. But of course, that information relates to horses as a whole, not specifically warhorses. The armour evidence is so crucial to our project because it informs us about horses used for war or for the tournament. It's precisely datable, but very chronologically limited. The earliest example is 1400 or so. The historical record where it survives provides us with fine-grained information, particularly about royal breeding. No information at all about horse stature. Portable material culture, we have that huge data set, thousands of objects. There's a lot to tell us about decoration and horsemanship, but there are biases towards high-status horses, certain regions. The landscape evidence has a great deal of untapped information on equestrian infrastructure, but evidence on the ground is ephemeral. And finally, visual culture. It complements our material culture evidence as a source for equestrian apparel. It tells us about organic things that don't survive in the archaeological record. Saddles, for example. And it provides insight into the changing prominence, the character of horse culture. Some information on stature, but there are artistic biases. So finally, to conclude, I'd just like to conclude with 3 very, very brief slides that provide some reflections on what the project contributes to our chronological understanding of development of the warhorse over the Middle Ages. This is an image which you'll find in the shortly to be published monograph of the project. It's this is a reconstruction of a horseman around 1050 AD. And the images around it show close-ups of artifacts that are more likely to survive archaeologically. In this period, 850 to 1160, horses are a crucial component of warrior aristocratic culture. In this period, I think it is the case that aristocratic horses are used interchangeably for war and for hunting. In terms of the impact of the Norman conquest has quite a limited signature in equine material culture. We see this quite puzzling dip in horse stature, but in terms of equestrian apparel, very, very little changes other than the bit. It's the curb bit, the levered bit, which probably tells us about Norman horsemanship. There's long-term continuity in breeding environments. It's not that Anglo-Saxon studs are abandoned and Norman ones are located in new places. If the Norman conquest has a limited signature in terms of equine archaeology, I think there are clearer horizons of change in the early 11th century. Particularly the reign of Canute, we see a rise in ostentatious horse gear. There's also a very clear horizon in the mid-12th century, around the reign of King Stephen, the so-called anarchy of the mid-12th century. Tournament culture is booming. These decorative pendants appear in the archaeological record in large numbers. Moving on, this is a representation of a warhorse. Again, aspects of material culture that might survive archaeologically that dates to about 1250, that reconstruction. This is a period that we see the true warhorse of the High Middle Ages take shape, but it's important to stress it's not simply destriers that are being bred for war. Key thing that emerges from the documentary analysis is that from the 1330s onwards, particularly in response to changes in warfare, we see coursers being bred for military purposes. Of course, formerly a hunting horse, now very much used for military purposes. We do see some evidence of limited increases in horse stature, but it's actually not so much in changes in horse height that we see at this period. It's changes in how robust these animals are. There's a lot of zooarchaeological evidence for the rear limbs becoming more robust. This is a period that sees a high point of documentation. It's when the royal stud accounts survive. The science of equine management is codified. And it's a period that sees the horse play having increasing prominence in visual culture. In the 14th century, for example, we see horses appearing in funerary monuments, really for the first time since the Viking period. We see the cult of St. George having an impact on how war horses are represented. Finally, the late medieval horseman. That's a representation of a horseman dated to about 1470, 1480. It's a period that, of course, with developments in armour, sees increasing protection, increasing ostentation. Some of these developments are related to changes in warfare, but we also speculate in the book about whether sharply rising levels of horse ownership among the peasantry in a post-Black Death world also drive changes in ostentation in horse gear. It's a period in which the equestrian landscape par excellence, the tilt yard, becomes archaeologically visible. And then right at the end of the period, the project is covered. In the Tudor period, although there's a late medieval decline in the military uses of horses, well attested in documents, in the Tudor period, we do see a reinvention, a reinvigoration of a medieval image of the war horse, particularly in the reign of Henry VIII. Sees also state interventions around breeding and the export of horses for the first time. So to just highlight some very brief conclusions, I hope to have underlined how the project has adopted a multifaceted, a multi-scale approach, underlining that it can provide, an approach like this can provide new light on a subject that's supposedly very well studied historically. A headline about the way that horses are bred is very, very clear in the Middle Ages, that there's no concept of horse breed as we understand it. Horse owners, trainers, breeders, they're selecting horses by type, by coat color, by physical attributes, by temperament, absolutely not in terms of their height, in terms of their withers height. Finally, my final reflection is that hopefully the talk has given shone light on how horses are revered in life. However, without any exceptions at all, they're completely ignored in death. Their remains are scattered and forgotten for archaeologists to find. Thank you very much. If I could just highlight very briefly some acknowledgements. If you'd like to find out more, do visit our website. If you'd like to find out even more, we've deposited our data sets with the Archaeology Data Service. And a final shameless plug for the book, which will be published at the end of March next year with a discount code. Thank you very much.
Oliver, thank you so much. A wonderful exposition of sort of interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary work, really changing the landscape of the horse. Really very interesting indeed. If I can kick off the questioning, I'm interested in whether you did very much on the pathology of the horses. You showed us that one very good image. But as the use of the horses changes, is that shown in sort of disease and the wear on the bones and so forth in any ways?
Thank you for the question. It's an excellent one. We carried out a lot of new primary work on the assemblages from the 20 case study sites. The majority of them were castles, places like Porchester, Barnard Castle, through to Elverton Street and other manorial sites as well. I mean, the key pathologies were I think the pronunciation is spavin, arthritic conditions that affect horses. Those can affect any sorts of horses. I mean, the ones that we think are quite diagnostic to war horses, particularly bit damage. It's why I showed the image of the horse at Barnard Castle. It's difficult to describe unless you've seen one, but a curb bit has a lever within the horse's mouth. And if it's levered up too violently, it can cause damage to the palate. So I think that is clear evidence of certainly a very high status horse, if not a war horse. And the other type of pathology that shows up very clearly is manger wear, where horses have bitten the manger and worn enamel from their teeth. That's a long-winded answer. To get to the precise bit of the answer, no, we haven't got the information to pick up chronological changes. That's a project for the future.
Thank you. Fascinating. Open to the floor. Are there, John?
Oliver, that was fascinating. Thank you very much indeed. Really engaging. It takes quite a lot to keep me awake at this time of the year in lecture, and you absolutely did. So brilliant. Thank you. Two questions, one very brief. You mentioned medieval war horses or medieval horses being named by colour and toponym.
Yeah.
I'd love just one example of that because I've never come across that. And the second thing is sort of more of an observation that I know what you mean about stables being invisible, but I wonder whether castles are the wrong places normally to be looking for them. I mean, you know, I immediately think of both New College and Winchester. They have perfectly good medieval stables still standing. And even something like Kenilworth, of course, as I'm sure you're aware, it's pretty clear that's a mid-16th century copy of a 15th century stable at Warwick, which is bizarre because it has decorative plasterwork on it. So I feel there are perfectly good ways of finding out more about medieval stables, though I think possibly it's rather irrelevant because they are just sheds, really. And I don't know whether there is a relationship between studs and stabling, or whether the stabling is actually a discrete undertaking, where there are two kinds of stables, as it were.
Yeah, so the horse names, there's a multiplicity of them. We've got a great list of them in the Sorrel Woodstock, Sorrel de Woodstock. That would be an example. I mean, there are also nicknames as well. You know, the cardinal. I mean, that's the other human characteristic that they have. They sometimes have two names and a nickname as well, which is fabulous. Thank you for the point on stables. I mean, within castles, I think there does seem to be something of a general rule. They're immediately inside the gate, often on the left. You know, they're the first building that you would come across. But of course, you're right. A whole variety of other sites that we might find them in. Bishops' palaces is probably the other category of site. We carried out a geophysical survey of the Bishop's Palace in Exeter, just adjacent to Cathedral Close, and there's a long, thin geophysical anomaly that I think is a stable there.
Oliver, thank you very much indeed. I remember attending a talk you gave a few years ago when you were reporting, I think, on a Livonian castle where you discovered the remains of horses, or you were putting on the excavation there anyway. And I wondered whether, as part of this project, you'd also looked at the broader economic picture, if you like, the role of horses within medieval society. I mean, I appreciate it's not about war horses specifically, but whether you'd picked up, so obviously they're a critical part, as you said at the very beginning, in terms of the resources of society devoted to the raising and caring for. And you talked about the veterinary book, which of course is not unique in the 13th century.
Yes.
But whether you picked up any of that, which could put it in a broader social and economic context.
Yeah, I confess we didn't do an enormous amount of work on that. I mean, we were quite specific in the historical work, in that the historic. I hope this is the right way of putting it, but within the context of the project, the historians work to an archaeological agenda. I mean, it's very often the other way around, as we well know. But the focus of the work was really combing those documents for physical details, for locations and physical details. I mean, we took the view that, I mean, the social history of the horse, certainly the economic context of the horse had been reasonably well studied. I confess we touch upon it in the conclusion of the book, but we didn't retread that path too much. I confess.
We do have a question online asking what similar work is being done internationally, elsewhere in Europe or in the Middle East.
Sorry, what sort of work is being done internationally?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, in answer to that, when I showed the cast of thousands who are involved in the project, one of the cast of thousands is a student called Helene Benkert, who recently finished a PhD with us in Exeter. She's one of two linked PhDs linked to the project, and she carried out an enormous zooarchaeological study of Western European evidence for horses, a large database for Western Europe, and then detailed work on particular sub-regions. So she will be publishing that soon. There are some headlines in our book. I mean, if I just identify one aspect of the value of that approach, a couple of times I mentioned this really puzzling dip in the Norman period in the stature of horses. It's quite minor, but it's as clear as day, and it is slightly counterintuitive. It's the opposite of perhaps what you might imagine. When we initially saw that result in the English data, we thought this must be a reflection of Norman devastation of the stud network, dislocation of horse breeding environments, for example. However, Helene's work showed that across Western Europe, around the magic year 1000, there's a similar dip. So it's a pan-European phenomenon. So it shows the value of that work. So Helene Benkert, do watch out for her papers in the future.
There, I think, one in the middle, two at this end.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. I understand, of course, that the Warhorse has had a tremendous influence on the history of Eurasia. But have you ever considered that if zebras were involved, zebras are horses too. They're all in the genus Equus, but zebras cannot be tamed. They cannot be ridden. And so how would history have panned out if the horse was not be able to be tamed and the zebra was?
I'd love to be able to give an answer. I have to say, I mean, it's been the most wonderful project to be involved with and to lead, because it's so collaborative and it's involved touching on so many different branches of archaeology. That's the fascination of it and the appeal. One of the great dangers of it is that when I give a presentation like this, I can of course get questions from 10 or 12 subfields that I might not have the answer to. I have a colleague who I would defer to on that. I mean, incidentally, I mean, you mentioned the Eurasian aspect to it. I mean, the reason the project came about was a dialogue between me. I have medieval interests. I've worked on castles and landscapes and elite culture, and my colleague Alan Outram, who I don't think I named specifically in the talk, but Alan, among other claims to fame, found the earliest domestic horse in Kazakhstan. So that was part of the inspiration for the project. He would know the answer. If I could phone a friend, I would. Do you have a thought on the answer? Do you have a thought on the answer about zebra? I mean,
where he emphasizes that ecological and evolutionary development in the world have been crucial to the basis of our history. And this is one of the chapters that he gives.
absolutely.
How did it come about that in Kazakhstan or in Central Asia, they were able to tame the animal and use it?
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for an excellent presentation. It's two intertwined questions. We're so used to thinking now, measuring a horse in hands. Where did that concept first become standardized then? And secondly,
Shall I answer that one? Sorry, fire up.
Okay, and secondly, given that size doesn't occur in the records that you looked at, does that imply that size then wasn't an important characteristic when selecting?
Okay, in answer to the first, I can give a precise answer to that. So that hands high is an English invention. It's an invention of the Tudor period. Through the early Tudor period, there are a series of acts which regulate, first of all, the export. It's the first state attempt to regulate the export and the breeding of any species. The first act of Henry VII regulates the export of horses of a certain value, but it's a value. I can't remember quite what the value is. And then the first act of Henry VIII mentions horses that are measured to the withers, but in quite a roundabout way. And the second act of Henry VIII defines hands high in a much more precise way, and the third act in a more precise way. So you can see the system for measuring in hands developing. Yeah, it's the early reign of Henry VIII, very, 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 very clearly. In answer to the second question, can you remind me? Sorry. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I agree. Absolutely. There's a single record in the whole of the medieval period. It's in the 14th century, and it's exceptional. It's about a horse that's given as a papal gift to somebody in China, and the measurements of it are bizarre and very, very difficult to interpret. Not least because we don't quite know which bits of the horse are being measured, and the length of the horse. I think that's the first measurement. It's the length rather than the height, and we don't quite know that they're going up to the top of the head or the withers, as seems natural from the Tudor period onwards. I think you're absolutely right. Horses are not being selected for their size. It's a series of other attributes: their coat color, their temperament, how bright their eyes are, how wide their nostrils are, how narrow their back is, how powerful their hindquarters are. It's not height. I think that's something that becomes a Tudor state-led obsession.
Anushka, there's one you got her, and then.
Hello. Thank you so much. That was fascinating. And I just wondered, you talked about how horses were relatively stationary in the first 2 years of their life. And you talked a lot about armour, but I wondered if any elements of the equipment of training a horse had survived, and how, today, for example, poles and like leads are used. And I wondered if you knew anything about that early phase of their lives before they kind of had the secondary.
Yeah, I mean, Jordanus Rufus provides a lot of detail on precisely that. I can mention another PhD student of ours, Camille Mylan Vauvan-Key, recently finished a PhD at the University of Exeter. She's worked specifically on Jordanus Rufus. And she's an equestrian. I should say I'm not an equestrian. The last equestrian thing I did, I think, was at Weymouth Beach when I was 6 or 7 years old. But I was privileged to work with several equestrians, including Camille, Kate Cannon, another co-worker. It was a polo coach, so we had a lot of equestrian insight. Camille, through the course of the project, had 2 Dartmoor ponies that she trained using aspects of the Rufus method. I mean, the 2 things that really stick in my mind at an early stage are Rufus provides a lot of very, very detailed guidance about, it's a translation, habituating the horse by touching it, getting it used to human touch, but making sure that happens while the foal is next to a more mature horse. Very, 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 very insistent on that touching it, and getting it used to human touch. And the other bit is habituating it to the bit. And Jordanus Rufus tells us that the bit covered in honey, that tastes sweet to the horse. So Rufus is very, very detailed on the early phases.
That really was absolutely fascinating, the whole thing. Your high medieval destrier looked quite like a modern Highland pony.
Yes.
And I wondered, is there any genetic continuity between the horses you looked at and what we would now think of as modern horse breeds?
Right, thank you very much. It did look slightly like a Highland pony. I agree. I'm afraid I'm going to give a rather cliched answer, which is watch this space. The genetic work which I mentioned, which is led by Ludovic Orlando in Toulouse, that's being published separately to the monograph. We're having a project meeting about it very, very early in the new year. We hope to reveal the answers. We've got little snippets of information that Ludo has provided so far, but nothing enabling me to answer the question in detail. But watch this space.
And I think we all will. Can we thank Oliver for an absolutely splendid presentation? Thanks for so much. I give notice that the next meeting will be the Christmas meeting on Thursday, the 12th of December, 2024, when we will hear a paper, Returning to Our Roots, the Council for British Archaeology at 80 by Neil Redfern Fellow. This will be followed by the mulled wine reception that we always have Christmas. You'll need to buy a ticket either via our website or by seeing Yola in the office upstairs. The meeting stands adjourned. There's a drink outside. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thanks. Fantastic. No, really, really.
Good.
Yeah.
I hope it was okay to try and give an overview.